Welcome to the Cinema 4D interface. This video is going to give you a very brief overview of the different parts that are available in the Cinema 4D software. Right now we're looking at our viewport, and this is where you will create 3D objects. This is where you control how you see around the objects and where you animate the objects in a given 3D space. You notice that when I created an object, and this bank up here is our object bank, we will talk about in a couple minutes. But when I create an object, you see the object appears in two places. One inside the viewport itself, and second in the objects menu. You also notice that now, once an object is created, we can go into a couple other areas in our interface to see how the object is created, how to maneuver the object, and how to alter the object. If I look down here into my attributes manager, you notice now that we see information about this cube object. We see the size of it, we see what segments are, and the segments are the areas of polygon faces. We'll be talking a little bit more about this when we go into the surface tools. Also, we see our coordinates. Notice that now everything is at the center of the world, which is x equals 0, which is the red line, y equals 0, which is the green line, and z equals 0, which is the blue line. If I grab any of these axes, you notice that now in the coordinates manager, the numbers are actually changing. So you have a constant awareness of where your object is in the 3D space throughout your whole production process. I can also go in and add in more segments. Say, for example, I want to add in 4 on the X. You notice now that instead of the one face that we have, the polygon face, we have 4 of the faces going into the X direction. And you remember the X direction is the red bar. So anything that will going into that red bar direction. So this would be the top part of it, and you see now we have segments that are going across the top from left to right. I can go in and do this also for the Y, and go in and add in for the Z. And you notice now that our cube is more highly dense with more polygon faces. So this is actually a more high poly kind of a cube versus the one segment on all 3 axis cube. Next we have down here is the materials editor, and we'll be talking a lot more about this when we go into the textures and UV mapping. You can go in and simply click in file, add a new material. I just want to add in a color, so I will pick the color yellow, say OK. And to add a texture or material onto an object, simply just grab and drag onto the object. And now we have a yellow cube in our 3D space. Now a couple things are very important here to remember. Let's look at some of the areas of the icons. First, icons are going down. These are your surface tools and your control tools. This tool right here is your actual switch layout. Right now we're in standard layout, and you see I've created a couple of custom layouts here. If I wanted to go in and go into strictly modeling, I can switch to that one. And the ones I'm going to talk about is the ones that will come in with the default Cinema 4D package. So you have the modeling screen, and you notice now that the screen looks different. It's built for modeling where we have our surface tools that are handy. We have different functions as well as structures, but now the structures are down the bottom here. And you notice that in the structure we have a create polygon. And you notice that the icon now at the bottom is actually highlighted into this bar graph here. I can go in and switch to visualize if we're doing any type of architectural design. So it switches in to show you how to move into space, and we'll talk about something called the virtual walkthrough, where you can actually have record a 3D walkthrough without animating the camera, just pretty much using key combinations on your keyboard to animate a walkthrough through your 3D environment. Okay. I can go switch back to the layout here, and this is another way. If I go to Windows Layout, okay, I'm going to go into Animation now, and you notice now we have a timeline with a motion guide. Okay, we can look at the F curves, and again we'll talk about more of the timeline when we go into animation. You have the texturing, and you have your objects window here. And then we have the standard. Okay, and this is what we actually started out with the standard interface screen. So these are the surface tools here. Okay, this was to switch the layout. This is to make an object editable. We'll talk about more of this in detail when we get into surface tools. Okay. One thing is very important, that this is the model tool versus the object tool. The model tool is affected more so when you're doing scaling. You notice that by default, Cinema 4D starts in the model tool mode. If I want to scale this on the x-axis, you know in the model tool, you notice that every time I move this, it's a uniform scale. So it's not giving me a chance to elongate the cube in an x-axis. However, if I switch to the object tool, I can now elongate the cube, and model it the way that I want to model it to create any type of 3D shape that I'm working on in production. Okay. So again, very important. If you want to actually have non-uniform scaling, you use your object tool. If you want uniform scaling, you use your model tool. This tool here is the object axis tool, when I can click on and go to my move tool and move the axis around. Okay. The only way to actually functionally move it, you have to make this an object editable, and again, we'll talk about this more with the surface tools. Next, we have our points tool, which will be able to move with the points. Our edge tool, we'll be able to move the edges and control edge loops while designing characters, vehicles, things of that sort. And we have the polygon tool, which we can actually work with adding on more polygon faces or extruding or beveling those out. We have the default mode, which is automatically on. We're either in the model or the object mode, and this is the texture tool and the texture axis tool. So we'll talk about those more when we get into the texturing section. Going to the top of the interface and looking at the icons, this is the undo. So you notice that I was playing around with the uniform, non-uniform scaling. So if I click undo, you see now the steps that I was actually doing, even from texturing the cube, will go back to the original format. I can also go back in next and redo. And you see all the steps will be recreated or go back to the point where I want to create. This is the live selection tool where I can select an object. These are your transformation tools. This is the move tool, this is the scale tool, and this is the rotation tool. And you notice that this tool here shows what tool is active in your viewport. Okay. These are the X lock, X-axis lock, the Y-axis lock, and the Z. And this is the difference between world and object coordinate systems. Again, we'll talk about that more in detail when we get into the modeling and animation. The next set of icons you have is the rendering information. This is the render the active view. You see automatically now when we render, we see a rendered version of the yellow cube. This here is the render and picture viewer. So I click on that. We'll see we have some information here and a window to show our final render. So we can go in and talk about filters as well as layer information and just information of the size, the color format, and the title safe and action safe of the image that's rendered out. This is the render settings or render setup. And again, we will talk about this in detail when we get to the rendering section and the advanced rendering section. Next set of icons are your tools you can create in Cinema 4D. We have our primitives. Okay. And a few of these you see here is a cube, a sphere, a cone, a cylinder. Okay. Next we have our splines. Okay. And splines are pretty much the same type of information if you're working with Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Freehand, where you're actually making points to make vector images or vector shapes. Next icon is our NURBS. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail of how to take a spline and extrude out a spline or loft it to make a 3D shape. Next icon is our special modeling. We will go in and if we needed certain groups such as an array or we need to cut a hole inside of a 3D object, we use a boodle, which is technically called a boolean. Next we have our deformers. And you see we have deformers such as bend, a bulge, we have a shear, we have a jiggle, okay, a taper. Next we have our lights, our cameras, and our environment information. Again, when we talk about cameras and lightings and advanced rendering, we'll go into this section in great detail. This is the make and break of all the work that you do in production. So this is very crucial, and we spend a lot of detail in this so you have perfect production results at the end of all your work. And finally, we have our particle systems. We have the emitter itself, which is a 3D object that emits 3D particles or 3D shapes into the 3D space, and different ways to have those affected within the 3D world, such as a rotation or to show gravity. If you're creating rain, the particles fall down to the ground. This is our selection filter. We'll talk about this more when we get into the viewports. This is our display filter. What objects that really will be created. And again, when we talk about viewports, we'll go into it in more detail. And this is our content browser, and you click on. And the content browser is just pretty much information that's on your computer and what you received on the Cinema 4D CD. So extra types of information such as sky presets, texture presets, advanced rendering presets to create global illumination or caustics effects. So this video is just giving you an introduction to the interface. We're now going to go into each one of these sections in a little bit of detail and talk about them a little bit more.